After spending 12 years on death row, Steven Nelson was executed by lethal injection on February 5, 2025, at the Huntsville unit in Texas. To understand how Steven Nelson lay strapped to the gurney in the heart of the execution chamber, we have to go back to a morning inside a quiet Texas church where a pastor lost his life and a 69-year-old secretary barely survived. What happened behind those church doors wasn't just a robbery. It was sudden, devastating, and in the eyes of the law, unmistakable. Prosecutors didn't hesitate. Police and paramedics were called to a church in Arlington, Texas. NorthPointe Baptist Church, a quiet place once filled with music and prayer. But that day, it was a crime scene. Inside, they found devastation. Visible red stains were found on the church floor. 2 people, lying motionless, both with catastrophic injuries to their heads, backs, and bodies. It didn't take long for authorities to track someone down. The evidence pointed in one direction, Steven Nelson. And in the eyes of the law, there would be no escape because the signs had always been there. The aggression, the instability. But on March 3, 2011, it all came undone. Nelson, who was still on probation at the time for violating his girlfriend, forced his way into the church that morning. Inside were 2 people, 28-year-old Pastor Clint Dobson and 69-year-old Judy Elliot, a secretary. He came to rob, but what followed was far more brutal. Dobson was physically attacked, then found with a computer extension cord wrapped around his neck. Nelson smothered him with a plastic bag to make sure he was gone. Elliot was targeted next, suffering repeated blows to her face, arms, legs, and back. Her skull was fractured. She was left barely clinging to life. Nelson stole Dobson's laptop, a phone, Elliot's credit cards, and her car. He used the cards to buy clothes and jewelry, and sold the laptop for cash, then disappeared. Back at home, Dobson's wife couldn't reach him. She called Jake Turner, the church's part-time music minister, who agreed to check the church. Turner also contacted Elliot's husband, John. John arrived first. He had a passcode to the building. When he stepped inside, nothing could have prepared him for what he saw. Dobson's office was in disarray. On the floor was a woman beaten beyond recognition. He didn't even realize it was his wife. But Clint Dobson was still out of sight, his body hidden behind the desk. Police arrived within minutes. Officer Jesse Parrish was the one who found him. Clint Dobson was pronounced lifeless at the scene. Judy Elliot was rushed to the hospital. She survived, but just barely. Doctors warned that the damage was extensive. She suffered a heart attack during her stay. Her face had to be rebuilt using mesh, screws, and metal supports. She spent 2 weeks in the hospital, followed by 5 months of rehabilitation. An autopsy was performed by Dr. Nissim Pawani, the medical examiner for Tarrant County. The findings were grim. Pastor Clint Dobson had fought back. His injuries showed signs of a struggle. Defensive wounds, trauma to the skull, and blunt force injuries were likely inflicted by the butt of a firearm. 2 of the wounds on his forehead matched the shape of the computer monitor stand found in his office. According to Dr. Pawani, Dobson was probably still standing when the first blow struck his head. Then, as he fell, he was hit again, this time in the back of the skull. But it wasn't the blows that ended him. Dr. Pawani certified the cause of passing as asphyxiation by suffocation. A plastic bag had been pulled over Dobson's face and sealed shut. It suffocated him. A memorial service was held shortly after. At NorthPointe Baptist Church, over 200 mourners gathered to honor his memory. They spoke of Dobson's compassion, his service, his quiet presence in the lives of those he served. But as the community mourned, police pressed forward with their investigation. Dobson's passing was classified as homicide. Steven Nelson had been scheduled to report to his probation officer on the day of the incident. He didn't show. And when officers found him, they also found damning evidence. Items belonging to both Judy Elliot and Clint Dobson were in his possession. Red spots were found on Nelson's shoes. Forensic testing confirmed the DNA matched both victims. Fingerprints recovered at the scene also linked directly to him. Nelson was arrested and charged with a capital offense, a charge that under Texas law carries 2 options: life without parole or the highest penalty. The second man, 19-year-old Anthony Gregory Springs was also taken into custody, but the homicide charge against him was eventually dropped. He was released. For Steven Nelson, there would be no release. The law had caught up with him, and this time there would be no going back. He was arrested, indicted for the homicide of Pastor Clint Dobson. While awaiting trial, his behavior became erratic, angry, and unpredictable. Correctional officers documented it time and time again. He broke the phone in the visitation booth. He damaged state property. He threatened an officer. Fights broke out, some so aggressive that guards were forced to restrain him. In one incident, it took 3 officers just to subdue him. The behavior didn't stop. But it wasn't the fights, the threats, or the defiance that drew the most attention. It was what happened on March 19, 2012. That day, something shifted. The incident began with a word, a racial slur, muted, but not unnoticed. Jonathan Holden, a mentally ill inmate serving time for theft, had allegedly muttered a derogatory term toward African Americans. Some prisoners overheard, tensions rose, no punches were thrown, but the air changed. The silence after that word was almost heavier than the word itself. Holden and Steven Nelson weren't cellmates. Each man was housed alone, but they were close enough to hear each other, close enough to see. And whatever thoughts crossed Nelson's mind in that moment, one thing was certain. Something in him had snapped. Nelson crafted a noose out of a torn blanket. According to witness reports, he called Holden to the bars of his cell. The noose wasn't hidden. Nelson made no effort to disguise what it was. He told Holden it was a fake suicide stunt, a way to get transferred to another unit. For reasons that remain unclear, Holden agreed. He placed his neck into the loop. And then Nelson pulled. With his feet braced against the bars, Nelson yanked the blanket tight with both hands, pulling Holden forward, pressing him against the metal, lifting him nearly off his feet. It lasted 4 minutes. When it was over, Holden was gone. Witnesses say Nelson didn't look back. There were reports that he danced, that he celebrated. According to reports, he mimed playing a guitar with a broom shortly after the incident. There was no apology, no explanation. Holden's passing wasn't forgotten. The details slowly emerged. And though both men were already isolated in solitary housing, Nelson was moved again, shifted to a different cell on the same corridor, further away from others. But the behavior didn't stop. Even from deep inside segregation, Nelson continued to violate rules, provoke officers, and disrupt the little order that remained. 2 years after Holden's passing in 2014, the family filed a civil rights lawsuit against Tarrant County. It didn't go to trial. The case was quietly settled. The county paid $350,000. No statement, no closure. But that wasn't the only courtroom Nelson would face. On October 1, 2012, Steven Nelson stood before a Tarrant County jury. Not for the homicide of Jonathan Holden, but for the homicide of Pastor Clint Dobson. Charges were filed. 1 count of capital offense and 1 count of attempted capital offense related to Judy Elliot. The prosecution made its intentions clear. They would seek the highest penalty. And this time, the state wasn't going to look away. They described Steven Nelson as a lifelong threat, someone whose aggressive tendencies had taken root early and only escalated over time. They detailed a childhood marred by fire setting and crimes committed before he was even old enough to attend grade school. At just 3 years old, Nelson set fire to his mother's bed. By 6, he was already in trouble with Oklahoma's juvenile justice system, property crimes, burglaries, theft, and aggravated violations. Efforts were made to intervene. Nelson was placed on probation. He received counseling, but it didn't work. Eventually, he was sent to a high-risk juvenile detention center. And the pattern continued. After his family moved to Texas and settled in Tarrant County, Nelson was tried in the juvenile courts there. At 14, he was arrested for unauthorized use of a vehicle, burglary, and criminal trespassing. Though originally sentenced to 9 months at the Texas Youth Commission, he remained there for more than 3.5 years, largely due to disciplinary infractions and 4 serious misconduct hearings. By 20, he'd already been released on parole twice and violated it both times. The prosecution outlined his continued offenses as a young adult. In 2005, at 18, Nelson was arrested for driving a stolen car. 2 years later, in 2007, he stole a laptop from a Walmart by concealing it in his pants and posing as an employee. The very next week, he was caught at another Walmart for stealing boots, walking out without paying. They told the jury he had just been released from state jail in 2010 when things got worse. Nelson had violated his girlfriend and was indicted for aggravated violation with a fatal weapon. She later asked the court to drop the charges, but the district attorney refused, citing Nelson's long history of aggression. He was instead placed on probation and sent to a 90-day program at the Intermediate Sanctions Facility. Then came the homicide of Pastor Clint Dobson. The prosecution didn't just rely on the Dobson case. They also pointed to Nelson's behavior. While behind bars, his repeated violations of prison rules, and one act of aggression more disturbing than the rest: the homicide of Jonathan Holden, a mentally ill inmate. To the state, it all added up to the same conclusion. Steven Nelson was, in their words, a lingering menace. He'd failed every rehabilitative program offered to him. He was dangerous, and they argued he deserved the ultimate punishment. If you find stories like this important, consider subscribing to this channel and turning on your notification button. They said Nelson acted alone when he took the life of Pastor Clint Dobson and violated Judy Elliot. They showed the jury forensic evidence, red stains on Nelson's shoes, the victim's belongings found in his possession, and proof that he had used their credit cards after the event. They also noted that Nelson had sold Dobson's laptop shortly after the incident. It was mostly circumstantial, but it was enough. Nelson testified in his defense. He admitted to being at the church that day, but said he wasn't the one who did it. He claimed 2 other men, Anthony Springs and Claude Jefferson, were also involved. Nelson said the 3 of them entered the church together. He admitted to stealing Elliot's keys and credit cards and taking Dobson's laptop. But according to Nelson, it was Springs and Jefferson who stayed behind with the victims while he stood outside as a lookout. Both men denied any involvement. Jefferson claimed he was taking a chemistry test at the time of the act, though the test couldn't be confirmed. Springs's phone records placed him more than 30 m away. As for the physical evidence, Dobson and Elliot's DNA on Nelson's shoes and fragments of his broken belt found at the scene, Nelson said that it was because he crawled under a table to retrieve a laptop bag. The defense fought back. They asked the jury to consider Nelson's life in full, starting with the home he was raised in. They spoke of abandonment, mistreatment, and the absence of care. His mother often left him alone for days at a time. His father was rarely present, and when he was aggressive. To both his wife and children, there were no constants in Nelson's life, no structure, no safety. On October 8, 2012, the jury returned its verdict. Steven Nelson was found guilty of capital offense and attempted capital offense. On October 16, 2012, Judge Mike Thomas pronounced the sentence, the highest penalty. All 12 jurors had agreed. Nelson was 25 years old. What happened next was defiant. Moments after the sentence was announced, Nelson shattered a fire sprinkler head inside the courtroom, releasing a flood of black fire retardant liquid. It was retaliation aimed at the jury, at the judge, at the system that had condemned him. He showed no remorse. After sentencing, Nelson was moved to the Allen B. Palinski unit in Livingston, Texas. It was there on Roe that he would spend the next 12 years. On June 10, 2024, Judge Stephen Jums signed Steven Nelson's sentencing order. The date was set for February 5, 2025. If carried out, it would mark the first sentence in Texas that year. During the long waiting years, he filed appeal after appeal, but all were denied. February 3, 2025, Nelson insisted one final time that he was innocent. His final appeal had been denied. The sentence would proceed. 7 p.m. February 4, 2025. Huntsville Unit, Huntsville, Texas. Time was no longer on Steven Nelson's side. At just 37 years old, he sat in a cell only a few feet away from the chamber. His body remained still, but his thoughts did not. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. He remained mostly quiet during his final hours. He tried not to think about what was coming, but it was impossible not to. He was hours away from being executed by lethal injection. He had spent years reflecting on how his life had unfolded. He remembered the trial, the charges, the headlines. On the afternoon of February 5th, just hours before the state prepared to carry out the sentence, Texas no longer honors last meal requests. That tradition ended in 2011. So, like all other inmates scheduled to go, Nelson was served the same standard meal offered to the general prison population. He did not make any special request. And then it was time. 6:30 p.m. Nelson was led to the chamber. He offered no resistance. He was strapped to the gurney. Through the viewing window stood his wife, Helen Noah Dubois, whom he had married while in prison, clutching the white service dog they had shared. Reverend Jeff Hood, Nelson's spiritual advisor, stood with him inside the chamber, offering prayers as the moment drew closer. When asked for his final words, Nelson turned his head slightly and spoke softly. His words were intimate, meant for one person only, his wife. "I will always love you no matter what. Our love is uncontrollable. I'm at peace. I'm ready to be at home. Let's ride, Warden." The injection began. The chemicals moved through his body. There was a brief jolt, then quiet. At 6:50 p.m., Steven Nelson was pronounced lifeless. For some, justice had been served. For others, another life had been taken in a cycle that began decades earlier in a troubled Texas home. In the end, Steven Lawayne Nelson's story is a reminder that the path to violence often starts long before the crime itself. Broken homes, neglected childhoods, and unresolved pain can grow into something far darker if left unchecked. And while the law can punish the act, it can never undo the life that shaped it.